"I'm not worth anything," she whispered. The rancher took her hand and smiled. She stood on a wooden platform in the center of town, barefoot and trembling, while men shouted numbers like she was livestock. Her hands were bound. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She kept her eyes on the ground because looking up meant seeing the faces that saw her as something to own, something to use, something worthless. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd. The bids climbed higher. She didn't flinch anymore. She'd learned not to. But then someone bid an amount that made the entire crowd go silent. A man in a worn hat stepped forward. He didn't look like the others. His face was weathered, his hands scarred from work, but his eyes weren't cruel. They were steady, calm, almost sad. The auctioneer grinned and slammed his gavel. Sold. The man walked up to the platform. She expected him to grab her arm, drag her away like the others had done before, but he didn't. He stood there just below her and extended his hand, not to pull, but to offer. She stared at it, at him, and for the first time in months, she didn't know what to do, because men like him didn't exist. Not in her world, not anymore. But why was he smiling? The platform beneath her feet was rough, uneven. Splinters pressed into her bare soles, but she barely felt them anymore. Pain had become a language she understood too well, a constant whisper that told her she was still alive, even when she wished she weren't. The sun beat down without mercy. Sweat traced lines through the dust on her face. Her wrists ached where the rope cut into skin already raw from weeks of the same restraint. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the wooden boards, counting the knots in the grain because looking up meant seeing them. The men. They circled the platform like vultures, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made her stomach turn. Numbers. Always numbers. That's all she was now. A sum, a price, a transaction waiting to happen. The auctioneer stood beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder too tightly. His fingers dug into the bone, holding her upright when her knees threatened to buckle. His voice boomed across the crowd, describing her like she was a horse or a plow, listing her qualities with the enthusiasm of a man selling something he'd never have to use himself. She tried to disappear inside her own mind. It was a trick she'd learned during the long nights in the wagon, when the men who'd captured her would sit around the fire and talk about what they'd do with the profit. She would close her eyes and go somewhere else, somewhere with wide skies and her mother's voice, somewhere before everything had been taken from her. But the auctioneer's hand squeezed harder, pulling her back. "Look lively," he hissed under his breath. "You want them thinking you're sickly?" She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. A man near the front shouted a number. Another countered from the side. The bids climbed slowly at first, then faster. She recognized the pattern. They always started cautious, testing the waters, then grew bolder when they sensed competition. Her breath came shallow and quick. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. She wanted to run, but where would she go? Her legs were weak from days of poor food and little rest. The rope around her wrists was tied to a post behind her. Even if she managed to break free, they'd catch her before she made it past the first building. The auctioneer grinned, sensing the energy shift in the crowd. "Come now, gentlemen. You can do better than that. Strong hands, good worker. She'll earn back what you pay and then some." The words felt like stones being piled onto her chest. Strong hands. Good worker. As if that's all she'd ever be. She closed her eyes and whispered the words her mother had taught her long ago, before the world had turned cruel. Words about the sky and the earth, about belonging to something bigger than men and their greed. But the words felt empty now, hollow. Then the crowd went silent. It happened so suddenly that she opened her eyes despite herself. The auctioneer's grip on her shoulder loosened slightly. Everyone was looking toward the back of the gathering, where a man stood apart from the others. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that shadowed most of his face. His clothes were plain, work clothes, not the fine fabrics some of the wealthier bidders wore. But there was something in the way he stood, something in the set of his jaw, that made people step aside as he moved forward. He didn't look at anyone else. His eyes, dark, serious, were fixed on her. And then he spoke. One number, clear and firm. The amount was so high that the auctioneer actually laughed, glancing around as if waiting for someone to call it a joke. But the man didn't smile, didn't blink, just stood there waiting. The auctioneer's expression shifted from amusement to something closer to shock. He looked at the crowd, at the other bidders, giving them a chance to counter. But no one spoke. The number was too high. Absurdly high. "Sold!" the auctioneer finally said, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. The man walked toward the platform. She tensed, every muscle in her body preparing for what came next. The rough hands, the casual cruelty, the reminder that she was property now. But when he reached her, he didn't grab her arm, didn't yank the rope. Instead, he pulled a knife from his belt. Her breath caught. This was it. Whatever he planned to do, it would happen quickly. But he didn't move toward her. He cut the rope tying her to the post, then carefully, deliberately, sliced through the bindings around her wrists. The rope fell away. Her hands were free. She stared at him, confused, terrified, unable to process what was happening. He looked up at her. She was still on the platform above him, and did something that made no sense at all. He extended his hand, not to pull or grab, just offering, and he smiled. Not the smile of a man who'd just bought something, not the smile of someone claiming a prize. Something else, something she couldn't name because she'd forgotten what kindness looked like. She didn't take his hand, not at first. She just stared at it, at the calluses and scars that marked years of hard labor, at the steady way he held it there without forcing, without demanding. Around them, the crowd began to murmur. She could feel their eyes, their judgment, their confusion at why this man was acting so strangely. Winners didn't offer hands. They took what they'd paid for, and left. But he waited, patient. His expression never changed. Her own hands trembled as she slowly, cautiously placed one palm against his. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her down from the platform. The moment her feet touched the ground, her knees nearly gave out. She'd been standing for hours, locked in place by fear and exhaustion. He steadied her with his other hand at her elbow, just enough support to keep her upright. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, rough from years of speaking mostly to horses and empty fields. But there was no cruelty in it, no impatience. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. He released her elbow but stayed close as they moved through the crowd. People stepped back, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disgust. She heard the whispers, some calling him a fool for paying so much, others making crude jokes about what he must be planning to do with her. She kept her eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Her bare feet ached against the hard-packed dirt of the street. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't. Not until they were away from the platform, away from the leering faces and the auctioneer's satisfied grin. The man led her to a horse tied near the edge of the gathering. It was a sturdy animal, dark brown with white markings on its face. He untied the reins and turned to her. "I can lift you up or you can use the stirrup. Your choice. Your choice." The words felt foreign. When was the last time anyone had given her a choice about anything? She looked at the horse, then at the stirrup hanging at her eye level. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to grip the saddle and pull herself up. It took 3 tries, her muscles weak and uncooperative, but she managed. Some part of her needed to do it herself, needed to prove she wasn't completely broken. He mounted behind her, his movements efficient and practiced. She tensed immediately, every instinct screaming that this was when it would happen, when he'd show his true intentions, when the kindness would evaporate and reveal the monster underneath. But he kept distance between them, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins. "We've got about an hour's ride," he said. "You can lean back if you need to. I won't let you fall." She didn't lean back, didn't relax, just sat rigid as stone as the horse began to move, carrying them away from the town, away from the platform, away from the nightmare that had become her life. They rode in silence. The sun climbed higher, beating down without mercy. Sweat dripped down her spine. Her throat was so dry it hurt to swallow, but she didn't ask for water, didn't ask for anything. She'd learned that asking only led to mockery or worse. The landscape around them was harsh, rolling hills covered in dried grass, scattered trees offering little shade, rocks jutting up from the earth like broken teeth. Everything looked the same, endless, inescapable. After what felt like forever, he spoke again. "My name's Boone Dalton. I have a place about 10 miles north of town. Small ranch, just me and some cattle." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Her voice felt locked somewhere deep inside, buried under months of fear and pain. He didn't seem bothered by her silence. "You don't have to tell me your name. Not until you're ready. But I'd like to know it eventually. If that's all right. If that's all right." Another choice. Another impossibility. The horse's steady rhythm began to blur the edges of her awareness. Exhaustion pulled at her like hands dragging her underwater. She fought it, knowing that letting her guard down was dangerous, that closing her eyes even for a moment could be fatal. But her body betrayed her. Her eyelids grew heavy. Her shoulders sagged. She swayed slightly in the saddle. His hand moved to her waist, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you. You can rest. I promise nothing's going to happen." Promises. She'd heard promises before. They always turned out to be lies. But something in his voice and the gentle firmness of his grip made her want to believe. Just this once. Just for a moment. Her eyes closed. Her head tilted back despite every warning her mind was screaming. And she felt herself lean against him, felt the solid warmth of his chest supporting her weight. He didn't tighten his hold, didn't take advantage, just kept the horse moving steadily forward, one hand on the reins, the other making sure she didn't slide from the saddle. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had shifted. They were no longer surrounded by endless hills. Ahead, she could see a small structure, a house made of weathered wood, a barn beside it, a corral with several horses, his ranch, his territory, his rules. This was where she'd find out what he really wanted. This was where the mask would come off and she'd see the truth beneath the kindness. Her heart hammered as they drew closer. Every muscle tensed again, preparing for whatever came next. The horse stopped in front of the house. Boone dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. She ignored his hands and slid off herself, landing hard enough that pain shot up through her legs. He didn't comment on it, just tied the horse to a post and turned to face her. For a long moment, they just stood there. Her, small, trembling, waiting for the blow. Him, tall, steady, watching her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away. Then he did something that shattered every expectation she'd built in her mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The bill of sale. The document that proved he owned her. And without a word, he tore it in half. The torn paper fluttered to the ground between them. She stared at the pieces, her mind struggling to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. Men didn't destroy proof of ownership. Men didn't throw away money. Men didn't give up power once they held it in their hands. Her breath came fast and shallow. This was a trick. It had to be. Some elaborate game designed to make her lower her guard before he struck. "You're free," Boone said quietly. "That paper was the only thing binding you to anyone. Now it's gone. Free." The word meant nothing. She'd been free once, running through open land with her mother, learning which plants could heal and which could harm, listening to stories about their people and the way things used to be. But that freedom had been taken by men who saw her as something to capture, something to sell. This wasn't freedom. This was just a different kind of cage. She took a step back, her bare feet scraping against the dirt. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape route, calculating how far she could run before he caught her. Boone held up both hands, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to force you to do anything. You can leave right now if you want. Take the horse. Take food. Whatever you need." She didn't move. Couldn't. Because none of this made sense. Men who paid that much money didn't just let their purchase walk away. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper, her voice hoarse from weeks of not using it. He lowered his hands slowly. "Because you're a person, not property." "What happened back there?" He gestured toward the direction of town. "That was wrong. I had money, I could stop it, so I did. You don't know me." Her voice was stronger now, edged with suspicion. "I could be dangerous. I could steal from you. I could." "You could," he agreed, "but I don't think you will." He turned toward the house, giving her his back. Another gesture that made no sense. "There's a room inside. Door has a lock on the inside, not the outside. You can bolt it if you want. There's a bed, a basin for washing. I'll bring food and water in about an hour." He started walking, then paused and looked back over his shoulder. "My wife died 3 years ago. I still haven't touched anything in that room. It feels right that someone should use it, someone who needs it. Wife, dead." The words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She saw it then, the grief that lived in the lines around his eyes, the loneliness that shadowed his movements. He wasn't trying to replace what he'd lost. He was trying to do something that mattered, something that might balance out the weight of whatever regrets he carried. But understanding his motivation didn't mean she trusted him. He disappeared into the house, leaving her standing alone in the yard. The horse shifted its weight nearby, the leather saddle creaking. The sun pressed down, relentless. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. She could run, should run, grab the horse and ride until she found, what? More towns like the one she'd just left? More men who saw her as something to exploit? Or she could walk into that house, lock the door, rest for one night and leave at dawn. Her feet made the decision before her mind caught up. She moved toward the door, each step feeling like walking toward either salvation or destruction. The entrance was dark after the bright sunlight outside. She paused at the threshold, letting her eyes adjust. The interior was simple. A main room with a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace cold with summer heat. Everything was clean but spare. The home of someone who'd stopped caring about comfort but maintained basic order out of habit. To the right, a doorway led to a smaller room. She peered inside and saw exactly what he'd described. A bed with a faded quilt, a small table with a basin and pitcher, a single window with a piece of cloth serving as a curtain. And there, on the inside of the door, a metal bolt. She stepped inside and immediately slid the bolt home. The click of metal against metal was the most comforting sound she'd heard in months. The room smelled faintly of dust and something else. Lavender, maybe, or some other plant that had once been hung to dry and left its scent behind. She moved to the bed and sat down carefully, half expecting it to collapse beneath her. It held. The mattress was thin but clean. The quilt was soft under her fingers. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. This was temporary. She'd rest tonight, gather strength, and leave before he changed his mind about whatever game he was playing. Through the door, she heard him moving around in the other room. The scrape of a chair, the clink of dishes, normal sounds, domestic sounds, the kind of sounds that belonged to a life she no longer had any claim to. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She'd cried herself empty weeks ago. A soft knock on the door made her jump. "I'm leaving a plate out here," Boone called through the wood. "Water, too. You can get it whenever you want. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." She heard his footsteps retreat, waited, counted to 100, then 200. Finally, she slid the bolt back and opened the door just enough to peer out. The main room was empty. On the floor beside the door sat a plate with bread, dried meat, and some kind of cooked vegetables. Next to it, a cup of water. She grabbed both and retreated back into the room, bolting the door again immediately. The food was simple but more than she'd seen in days. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to make herself sick by eating too fast. The water was cool and clean. She drank half and saved the rest. When she'd finished, she lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, still ready to run at the first sign of danger. But exhaustion pulled her under like a river current. And for the first time in months, she slept without waking every few minutes in terror. She woke to darkness and panic. For a terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. The wagon, the auction platform, some other horror her mind had buried. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she sat up, disoriented, searching for threats in the shadows. Then, memory returned. The ranch, the room, the bolt on the door. She was still alone, still safe, at least for now. Through the small window she could see stars scattered across the night sky. How long had she slept? Hours at least, maybe longer. Her body ached with the kind of deep soreness that came from finally releasing tension held for too long. She slid off the bed and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. Just the distant sound of night insects and the occasional creak of the house settling. Her hand hesitated over the bolt. Every instinct screamed at her to stay locked inside to maintain this fragile sense of security. But she needed more water, and she needed to know what Boone was doing. Whether he was waiting for her to emerge so he could reveal his true intentions. She slid the bolt back slowly, minimizing the sound. The door opened without a creak. The main room was dark except for moonlight filtering through the windows. The table was empty, the chairs undisturbed. On the floor near the fireplace, she saw a form wrapped in a blanket. Boone, sleeping on the hard ground instead of in his own bed, giving her the only real room in the house. She froze, watching him for signs of movement. His breathing was deep and steady. Genuine sleep, not the fake kind men used when they were waiting to ambush. The pitcher of water sat on the table. She moved toward it with careful, silent steps, each footfall planned and precise. When she reached it, she filled her cup and drank deeply, her eyes never leaving the sleeping form by the fireplace. A floorboard creaked under her weight. Boone stirred but didn't wake, just shifted slightly and settled back into sleep. She retreated to the room, closed the door and bolted it again. Her hands were shaking. Such a small interaction, just getting water, and her entire body was flooded with adrenaline. She couldn't live like this. Couldn't spend every moment terrified, every sound a potential threat. But she didn't know how to stop. Fear had become her constant companion, her only reliable defense. She sat on the bed and pulled the quilt around her shoulders despite the summer warmth. Outside, something moved in the darkness. Probably an animal, a coyote or wild dog searching for food. The sound reminded her of other nights, other dangers. Sleep didn't return easily. She dozed in fits and starts, waking at every small noise, her mind creating threats where none existed. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtering through the curtain, she heard Boone moving around in the other room, the scrape of the front door opening and closing, his footsteps heading toward the barn. She waited until she was certain he was gone, then unbolted the door and emerged. The house was empty again. On the table sat another plate, more bread, some eggs, a piece of fruit she didn't recognize. Next to it, a note written in simple, careful letters. Take your time. No rush. I'll be working with the horses if you want to find me. If you don't, that's fine too. The kindness in those words felt like a weapon. It would be easier if he were cruel. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty she could fight against. But this gentle patience, this respect for her fear, it disarmed her in ways that made her feel even more vulnerable. She ate the food standing up, ready to retreat at any moment. When she finished, she moved to the window and looked out toward the barn. She could see him in the corral working with a young horse. The animal was skittish, dancing away every time he approached. But Boone didn't force it, didn't rush, just stood still, hand extended, waiting for the horse to make the choice to come closer. Something about the scene made her throat tight. She recognized herself in that frightened animal, wild, traumatized, unable to trust even when trust might be safe. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. She stayed in the house, watching through the window as Boone worked. He never looked toward the house, never checked to see if she was watching, just focused on his task with patient determination. Around midday, a rider appeared on the horizon, a woman on a dark horse, heading straight for the ranch. Ayanna's pulse quickened. This was it. Whatever arrangement Boone had made, whoever he'd promised her to, they were coming to collect. She backed away from the window, looking for another exit. But the house only had two doors, the front and a back entrance that led to a small yard enclosed by a fence. The woman dismounted near the barn. Boone walked over to greet her. They talked for several minutes, the woman's gestures animated, her voice carrying on the wind, though the words were indistinct. Then both of them looked toward the house. Ayanna's breath caught. This was the moment, the betrayal, the revelation that his kindness had been a lie designed to make her compliant. But Boone shook his head at something the woman said. His body language was firm, protective. The woman argued, pointing at the house again. Boone crossed his arms and said something short and final. The woman threw up her hands in apparent frustration, mounted her horse and rode away. Boone stood watching her leave, his shoulders tense. Then he turned toward the house, not approaching, just looking. His expression was tired, troubled. After a moment, he went back to the corral and continued working with the horse. Ayanna sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. He'd defended her, sent the woman away, whatever that conversation had been about. He'd chosen to protect Ayanna's privacy, her space. She didn't understand, didn't trust it, but she couldn't deny what she'd witnessed. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she made a decision. She unbolted the door, stepped outside, and walked slowly toward the corral. Boone saw her coming but didn't move to meet her halfway, just waited, giving her control over how close she got. She stopped several feet away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to run if needed. Who was that woman? Her voice was rusty from disuse but steady. Neighbor, Boone replied. Clara Tate. She heard I'd brought someone home from town. Wanted to meet you. I told her you weren't ready for visitors. She didn't believe you. No, but it doesn't matter what she believes. Matters what you're ready for. The young horse in the corral snorted and tossed its head, watching them both with nervous eyes. Ayanna looked at the animal, then at Boone. That horse doesn't trust you. Not yet, but it will, when it's ready. The parallel wasn't subtle, but somehow, Coming from him, it didn't feel manipulative, just honest. "My name is Ayanna," she said quietly. It was the first real thing she'd offered him, the first piece of herself she'd given willingly. His expression softened. "That's a good name. Thank you for trusting me with it." Trust. She wasn't sure she'd call it that, but it was something. A beginning, maybe, or at least not an ending. The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm. Boone worked the ranch from dawn until the sun hung low in the sky. Ayanna stayed close to the house, watching him from the windows, learning his patterns, searching for cracks in the facade of decency he presented. She found none. Every morning he left food on the table before heading outside. Every evening he returned only after she'd retreated to her room. He never entered without knocking, never asked her to work, never demanded anything in return for the shelter and food. It was the absence of demands that unsettled her most. She'd been taught through brutal experience that men always wanted something. Always. The fact that she couldn't identify what Boone wanted made her more nervous than if he'd been openly cruel. On the fourth morning, she ventured outside while he worked in the far pasture. The young horse he'd been training stood in the corral, calmer now, letting Boone approach and run a hand along its neck. The transformation was remarkable. The terrified animal from days ago now stood almost peaceful under his touch. She understood the method. Patience. Consistency. Never taking more than the creature was willing to give. But understanding didn't mean she was ready to lower her own guard. She walked to the small garden behind the house. It was overgrown, weeds choking what had once been neat rows of vegetables. This must have been his wife's work, abandoned after her death and left to return to wildness. Without thinking, she knelt and began pulling weeds. Her hands knew the work. Her mother had taught her which plants to nurture and which to remove. The familiar motions were soothing, giving her something to focus on besides the constant anxiety that hummed through her body. She worked for over an hour before she realized Boone was watching from near the barn. She froze, waiting for him to tell her to stop, to assign her more tasks, to reveal that this was what he'd been waiting for: free labor. Instead, he just nodded once and went back to his work. That evening, she found a pair of worn boots outside her door. They were too large, but better than walking barefoot. Next to them sat a hat to keep the sun off her face. No note, no explanation, just practical items left for someone who might need them. She stared at them for a long time before taking them inside. The next morning, she wore the boots and returned to the garden. The work felt good, purposeful without being forced. She cleared more weeds, identified plants that could be saved, began to imagine what the garden might look like if properly tended. Boone passed by once, carrying a bucket of water for the horses. He paused. "Garden looks better already." She didn't respond, just kept working, but something in her chest loosened slightly at the simple acknowledgement. Days blurred together. She expanded her territory bit by bit. The garden, the area around the house, eventually the barn when Boone wasn't inside. She found evidence of his solitary life everywhere. Tools kept in perfect order. Tack maintained with careful attention. Everything functional but joyless. The work of a man who'd lost his reason to care about anything beyond basic survival. One afternoon, while Boone was checking the fence line in the north pasture, Clara Tate returned. Ayanna saw her coming from the garden and immediately moved toward the house, her heart racing. But Clara didn't ride to the house. She stopped at the edge of the property and called out, "I know you're here. I'm not trying to scare you. I just want to talk." Ayanna stayed silent, hidden behind the corner of the house. Clara sighed. "Boone's a good man. Best man I know, actually. But he's stubborn. He won't ask for help even when he needs it. And he won't tell you things you deserve to know." Ayanna's curiosity warred with her caution. She stayed hidden, but listened. His wife, Margaret. She died giving birth. Baby didn't make it either. Boone blamed himself, thought if he'd gotten her to town faster, if he'd done something different, they'd both be alive. He's been punishing himself ever since, living out here alone, refusing to let anyone close. The words settled over Ayanna like cold water. She thought of the empty room, the untouched belongings, the way Boone slept on the floor rather than in his own bed. Grief so profound it had reshaped his entire life. "He paid all that money for you because he couldn't save them," Clara continued. "Because he saw someone suffering and this time, he could do something about it. I'm telling you this because I think you should know, not because I expect anything from you, just because you deserve the truth." Clara waited a moment longer, then turned her horse and rode away. Ayana stood motionless, processing what she'd learned. The pieces fit together now. The gentleness, the patience, the complete lack of expectations. Boone wasn't trying to own her. He was trying to save someone, anyone, because he'd failed to save the people he loved most. That knowledge changed something fundamental. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. And maybe that was the first step toward something else. When Boone returned at sunset, she was sitting on the porch steps, the first time she'd positioned herself where he'd have to pass close by to enter the house. He slowed when he saw her, uncertain. "Your wife," Ayana said quietly. "Clara told me. I'm sorry." Pain flashed across his face, quickly masked. "Clara talks too much. Maybe, or maybe not enough." Ayana picked at a loose thread on her dress. "You don't have to save me to make up for losing them. That's not how it works." Boone was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I know, but I can't undo what happened to them. I can only try to do better by the people still here. I'm not her." "I know that too." They sat in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The air cooled. Night insects began their chorus. "I don't know if I can stay," Ayana finally said. "I don't know if I can trust this. Any of this." "That's fair." Boone stood slowly. "But the offer stands. As long as you need. No conditions." He moved past her into the house, giving her space. Always giving her space. Ayana remained on the porch, looking out at the darkening land. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt something other than fear or despair. She felt possibility, fragile and terrifying, but real. The garden became her sanctuary. Every morning after Boone left for his work, she spent hours among the recovering plants, coaxing life back into soil that had been neglected too long. The physical labor grounded her, gave her purpose beyond simple survival. But the real change came slowly. In small moments she barely noticed until they'd already passed. The way she no longer bolted the door every night. The way she started eating meals at the table instead of hiding in her room. The way she could be in the same space as Boone, without her entire body tensing in preparation for violence that never came. 2 weeks after Clara's visit, Ayana was carrying water to the garden when she heard a commotion from the barn. The young horse, the one Boone had been training, was making distressed sounds, thrashing against something. She dropped the bucket and ran. Inside the barn, she found Boone on the ground, his leg twisted at an awkward angle. The horse, spooked by something, had kicked out and caught him. The animal now stood in the corner, wild-eyed and trembling. Boone's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "I'm all right. Just need a minute." But he wasn't all right. She could see the pain in the tight lines around his mouth, the way he couldn't put weight on the injured leg. For a split second she considered leaving him there, taking one of the other horses and riding away while he was helpless. This was her chance, maybe her only chance. Instead, she moved toward the frightened horse. Hands out, voice low and steady. She spoke in her mother's language, words of calm and comfort she hadn't used in months. The horse's ears twitched toward her. Gradually, its breathing slowed. She led the animal to a stall and secured it, then returned to Boone. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Maybe. With help." She positioned herself beside him, letting him lean heavily on her shoulder as he struggled upright. He was bigger than her, heavier, and the effort of supporting his weight made her legs shake. But she held steady. Together, they made it out of the barn and across the yard to the house. Each step was agony for him. She could tell by the way his breath came in sharp gasps. But he didn't complain. Inside, she helped him to a chair. His leg was already swelling, the boot tight enough to cause more damage if left on. She knelt and carefully unlaced it, pulling it off as gently as possible. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. The ankle was badly bruised and swelling rapidly. Not broken, she thought, but badly sprained. She'd seen enough injuries during her time with her people to recognize the difference. "Stay here," she ordered, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. She went outside to the garden and gathered specific plants, ones her mother had taught her could reduce swelling and pain. Back inside, she found a cloth and soaked it in cold water from the well. Boone watched her work with a mixture of pain and curiosity. "You know healing?" "Some. My mother taught me." The words came easier than she expected. She hadn't talked about her mother to anyone since before the capture. She wrapped his ankle with the cold compress, then applied the crushed plants over it. The treatment was basic, but effective. Better than nothing, at least. "You should rest." she said. Keep the weight off it. Ranch doesn't run itself. Ranch can wait a day or two. You can't work on a leg like that. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Something in her expression must have convinced him that arguing would be pointless. All right, he conceded. One day turned into 3. The injury was worse than either of them had initially thought. Boone could barely walk without support. Certainly couldn't do the heavy work the ranch required. So Ayanna did it. She fed the horses, checked the water troughs, moved the cattle to fresh grazing. The work was hard, her muscles unused to the physical demands, but she pushed through. Boone tried to give her instructions from the porch where he sat with his leg elevated, but mostly she figured things out herself. On the 3rd evening, as the sun set and she returned from checking the fence line, she found him attempting to stand without support. He made it 2 steps before his leg buckled. She caught him before he fell, her smaller frame somehow finding the strength to keep him upright. You're stubborn, she said. So are you. But he was smiling slightly, leaning on her more than he probably wanted to. She helped him back to the chair. As she did, their eyes met. Really met for the first time without her immediately looking away. His eyes were kind, tired and sad, but genuinely kind. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying, for helping. You didn't have to. I know. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they'd been. But you didn't have to do what you did either. I suppose we're even now. Is that what this is? Keeping score? She considered the question. Was it? Or was it something more complicated? A gradual recognition that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world was cruel. That some people actually meant what they said. I don't know what this is, she admitted. But I'm not ready to leave yet. The admission hung in the air between them. It was the closest she'd come to saying she might stay. Might build something here instead of just surviving. Boone nodded slowly. Then I'm glad you're here. That night, for the first time, she left her door unbolted. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else. But to her, it was monumental. A choice to believe, even tentatively, that she might actually be safe. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house. Boone moving carefully in the other room, settling in for the night. The wind through the eaves. The distant call of a night bird. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The kind of sounds she'd thought she'd never hear again. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something that might have been hope. The riders came on the 5th day after Boone's injury. 3 men, dust-covered and grim-faced, appearing on the horizon just after dawn. Ayanna saw them from the garden, and her blood turned to ice. She recognized the one in front, Malachi Vaughn, the man who'd been bidding against Boone at the auction, the man whose eyes had promised nothing but cruelty. She ran to the house. Boone was already on the porch, leaning heavily on a crutch he'd fashioned from a broken fence post. His face was set in hard lines as he watched the riders approach. Get inside, he said quietly. No, the word came out firm, surprising them both. She'd spent too long being told what to do, where to hide. I'm not hiding anymore. He looked at her, seemed about to argue, then nodded once. Stay behind me then. The riders stopped a dozen yards from the house. Vaughn dismounted with casual arrogance, his 2 companions staying on their horses. They were armed, pistols visible at their hips, rifles in saddle holsters. Dalton, Vaughn's voice carried across the distance. Heard you had an accident. Shame about that. What do you want, Vaughn? Just being neighborly, checking on your purchase. His eyes slid past Boone to Ayanna, making sure she's being treated proper. There are laws about how you handle property. She's not property, not mine, not anyone's. Vaughn laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. That's not what the auction records say. You bought her fair and square, which means if you're not using her, well, maybe you'd be willing to sell. I'll give you double what you paid. Ayanna felt Boone tense beside her. His hand tightened on the crutch until his knuckles went white. She's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Dalton. You're just not motivated enough yet. Vaughn gestured to the ranch around them. You're hurt. Working a place like this alone must be difficult. Add in feeding an extra mouth that doesn't earn its keep. That's just poor business. I don't recall asking for business advice. No, you just made a fool's choice driven by guilt over your dead wife. Vaughn's words were calculated cruelty, designed to wound. Everyone knows why you did it. Trying to save someone because you couldn't save her. It's pathetic. Ayanna felt rage surge through her veins, hot and sharp. She stepped out from behind Boone. You have no right to speak about things you don't understand. Vaughn's eyes locked onto her, and she saw the predator beneath the civilized surface. So she does talk. Good. Makes things more interesting. Leave, Boone said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Now. Or what? You can barely stand. You think you're going to stop 3 armed men? Vaughn took a step forward. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be reasonable. Sell her to me for a fair price. Or we'll come back when you're alone and we'll take her anyway. Ayana's heart hammered, but she refused to show fear. She'd been afraid for too long. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't get a choice. Girl, that's the whole point. Yes, she does. Clara's voice rang out from behind them. They all turned to see her riding up, and she wasn't alone. 5 more riders accompanied her, ranchers and hands from neighboring properties. All armed, all wearing expressions that suggested they weren't here for conversation. Clara dismounted and walked to stand beside Boone and Ayana. We heard you might be paying Boone a visit, Vaughn. Thought we'd stop by too. Make sure everything stayed civil. Vaughn's face darkened. This isn't your concern, Clara. Everything that happens on neighboring properties is my concern. That's how community works. She looked at the other riders. Right, boys. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. They were outnumbered now, and Vaughn knew it. This isn't over, Vaughn said, mounting his horse. Papers say Dalton owns her. That means he can sell her whenever he wants. And eventually he will. They always do. He rode off, his companions following. The dust cloud from their departure hung in the air like a threat. Clara waited until they were out of sight before turning to Boone. He's not wrong about one thing. Those auction papers, even torn up, there are copies, records. If he really pushes, he could make legal trouble. Boone's jaw tightened. I'll burn every record if I have to. There's a simpler solution. Clara looked at Ayana. You could leave, head north, change your name, start somewhere no one knows you. You'd be free, really free. The suggestion hung in the air. It was practical, sensible. Everything Ayana had wanted weeks ago. But now, standing in front of the ranch she'd helped maintain, beside the man who'd shown her that kindness wasn't always a trap, the idea of leaving felt wrong. No, she said quietly. I'm staying. Boone looked at her sharply. You don't have to. If staying puts you in danger, I've been in danger my whole life. At least here I'm in danger by choice. She met his eyes. You gave me that. The choice. I'm choosing to stay. Clara smiled slightly. Well then, we'll need to make sure Vaughn understands that trying to take her isn't worth the fight he'd face. The other ranchers nodded. They'd formed an unspoken alliance, not because of law or obligation, but because sometimes the right thing to do was obvious, even when it was difficult. After the neighbors left, promising to keep watch and come if there was trouble, Ayana and Boone stood together in the yard. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness. You didn't have to do that, Boone said. Stay, I mean, not for me. I know. I'm not doing it for you. She looked out at the garden, at the land she'd begun to know. I'm doing it for me, because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I have something worth fighting for. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what changed? What made you decide? She thought about it. The accumulated weight of small kindnesses, the slow erosion of fear, the realization that healing was possible even after everything had been taken from her. You never asked me to be grateful, she finally said. You never demanded anything. You just gave me space to remember who I was before all of this. She paused. I'm still figuring that out, but I want to figure it out here. Boone nodded slowly. Then you'll stay. For as long as you want. No conditions. No conditions, she agreed. It wasn't a grand declaration. Wasn't a dramatic moment of transformation. Just 2 damaged people acknowledging that maybe, together, they could build something that resembled healing. And sometimes, that was enough. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to early autumn, the heat breaking into cooler mornings and crisp evenings. The garden flourished under Ayana's care, producing more vegetables than 2 people could eat. She'd started trading the surplus with Clara and the other neighbors, building connections that felt foreign but increasingly natural. Boone's leg healed slowly but completely. He walked with a slight limp now. A permanent reminder of the day everything had shifted between them. He never complained about it, just adjusted his work to accommodate the limitation. They'd settled into a partnership that neither of them had planned, but both had come to depend on. She managed the garden and helped with the horses. He handled the cattle and the heavier ranch work. They ate meals together now, conversations flowing more easily with each passing day, but there was still distance between them. A careful space maintained by unspoken agreement. Two people who'd been hurt too deeply to risk more pain, even as they grew closer. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ayanna broke the comfortable silence. "Tell me about her. Your wife." Boone's hand stilled on the piece of wood he'd been carving. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "Margaret was strong. Stronger than me in most ways. She could rope a steer, birth a calf, mend a fence. But she was gentle too. Believed in seeing the good in people even when they didn't deserve it. She sounds remarkable." She was. His voice was thick with old grief. "When we found out she was expecting, she was so happy. Made plans for the nursery, talked about names, imagined what the baby would be like." He paused. "The labor went on too long. By the time I realized something was wrong, by the time I got her on a horse to ride for the doctor, it was too late. Lost them both before we made it halfway to town." Ayanna reached out and placed her hand over his. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact. His hand was warm and rough beneath her palm. "You couldn't have known," she said gently. "That's what everyone says. Doesn't make it easier to believe." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting years of accumulated guilt. "When I saw you on that platform, I saw someone I could help, someone I could save. I won't pretend it was purely selfless. I needed to prove to myself that I could protect someone. And did you? Prove it? I don't know. You saved yourself more than I saved you. All I did was give you space to heal. That's not nothing, Boone." She squeezed his hand. "Sometimes space is exactly what someone needs." They sat in silence for a while longer, hands still touching, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I should tell you about my mother," Ayanna said eventually. "About what happened before the auction. Only if you want to." She did. The words came slowly at first, then faster. The story of her village, of the men who came claiming legal authority to remove them from land her people had lived on for generations. The violence when they resisted. Her mother's death trying to protect her. The months of captivity afterward, passed from one cruel hand to another, until she ended up on that platform, broken and convinced she was worthless. Boone listened without interrupting. When she finished, his eyes were wet. "You survived all that," he said hoarsely. "You're stronger than you know. I didn't feel strong. I felt destroyed. Surviving when you feel destroyed. That's the definition of strength." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It felt natural, right? I'm not destroyed anymore. I'm healing. Because of this place. Because of you. Because of you," he corrected gently. "I just provided the place. You did the healing." The night deepened around them. Eventually, they went inside. Ayanna hesitated at the door to her room, the room that had been Margaret's, that she'd slowly made her own with small touches and personal items. "Boone," she said, turning to face him. "I need to tell you something." He waited, patient as always. "I don't think I can fall in love again. Not after everything." Her voice was steady but honest. "The part of me that trusted that completely, that believed in happy futures, I think it broke. Maybe permanently." She expected disappointment, expected him to pull away. Instead, he nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm not sure I can either. The fear of losing someone again. He struggled for words. "It's paralyzing. But I care about you," she continued. "I trust you. And I want to build a life here, with you, whatever that looks like. Even if it never looks like what people expect." A small smile touched his face. The first real smile she'd seen from him. "That sounds perfect to me." She stepped closer and took both his hands in hers. "I'm not worth anything," she whispered, repeating the words she'd said to herself on that platform months ago. Boone's grip tightened. His eyes held hers with absolute certainty. "You're worth everything," he said firmly. "And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you'll let me." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his heart. Not a romantic gesture, but something deeper. A promise of partnership, of mutual respect, of two people choosing to face their demons together rather than alone. She felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. These were different tears than the ones she'd cried before. Not tears of despair, but of release, of finally believing that maybe she could have a future that didn't hurt. "Then let's build something," she said. "Not what we lost. Something new. Something ours." "Something ours," he agreed. They stood there, hands clasped, two broken people who'd found in each other not a fix, but a companion for the journey of healing. It wasn't the fairy tale ending. It was something better, something real, something earned, something that acknowledged the scars while refusing to be defined by them. Outside, the autumn wind carried the smell of the recovering garden, the sound of horses settling in the barn, the promise of another day of work and slow progress toward peace. Ayana smiled, a real smile, unforced and genuine. For the first time since that terrible platform, since the whispered words of worthlessness, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt whole. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the untamed frontier, where courage and compassion forge unexpected bonds. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. She stood a full head taller than any man who had ever asked for her hand, and every single one of them had walked away. They called her a curiosity, a mistake of nature, too much woman for any reasonable life. But what none of them saw, what they were too afraid to recognize, was that Alara Folkman possessed something far more dangerous than unusual height. She had learned to carry weight that would break most men's backs, to work through pain that would send others to their knees, to survive alone in a world that had decided she did not belong anywhere. And when a lone Apache warrior arrived at the property that morning, bloodied and exhausted, he would see immediately what her own people had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Alara had been hauling fence posts since dawn. The wood was green and heavy, each piece requiring both hands and most of her considerable strength to maneuver into position. Sweat darkened the back of her plain cotton dress despite the cool morning air. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of this kind of work, gripped the timber without hesitation. She had learned long ago not to complain about splinters. The homestead sat 3 miles from the nearest town, far enough that most people forgot it existed. Vernon Cade owned the property but rarely visited, preferring to let Alara manage the daily labor in exchange for a place to stay and enough money to survive. It was an arrangement that suited them both. He did not have to look at her or explain her presence to curious neighbors, and she did not have to endure the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere else. She was 26 years old and had not spoken to another woman in almost 2 years. The fence line stretched across the southern boundary of the property, separating Cade's land from the open territory beyond. Alara worked methodically, setting each post deep enough to withstand the wind that swept across these plains with nothing to slow it down. Her arms burned from the effort, but she welcomed the pain. It gave her something to focus on besides the emptiness. She had been 12 when her mother died, 14 when her father remarried, and his new wife made it clear there was no place for a daughter who kept growing past what was natural. By 16, Alara was taller than her father. By 18, she was taller than every man in their settlement. The marriage proposals that came were either cruel jokes or desperate offers from men too old or too broken to attract anyone else. She had accepted none of them. The sound of hoofbeats made her straighten, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Riders rarely came this far out unless they were lost or looking for something specific. She scanned the horizon and spotted a single horse approaching from the east, moving fast but unsteady. As it drew closer, she could see the rider slumped forward, barely holding the reins. Alara dropped the post she was holding and started walking toward the house. Her long stride covered ground quickly, years of isolation having taught her to move with purpose when something felt wrong. The horse slowed as it reached the property line, its sides heaving with exhaustion. The rider wore traditional Apache clothing, the leather and beadwork unmistakable even from a distance. He slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, hitting the ground hard and staying down. Alara broke into a run, her boots kicking up dust as she closed the distance. When she reached him, she dropped to one knee and carefully turned him onto his back. Blood soaked through his shirt along his left side, dark and fresh. His eyes opened, dark and unfocused, and locked onto her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his gaze traveled upward, taking in her full height, even as she knelt beside him. And something shifted in his expression. Not fear or disgust or the careful politeness she was used to seeing. Something else entirely. Recognition. His hand moved to the wound at his side, pressing against it weakly, and he spoke a single word in a language she did not understand. Then his eyes closed and his breathing became shallow and rapid. Alara looked toward the house, calculating the distance and the effort it would take to move him. Then back at the wound that was bleeding faster than she liked. She made her decision in less than 3 seconds, scooping him up with both arms and rising to her full height in one smooth motion. He was not a small man, but she carried him as easily as she had carried those fence posts. His head rolled against her shoulder as she walked, his breath hot against her neck. Behind her, his horse followed without being led. Ahead, the door to the house opened, and Vernon Cade stepped onto the porch, his expression already hardening as he took in the scene. Ilara kept walking, her jaw set, knowing exactly what he was about to say, and knowing just as clearly that she was going to ignore him. Some decisions were too important to wait for permission, and something about the way that Apache warrior had looked at her, even bleeding and half-conscious, told her this was going to change everything. Vernon Cade did not move from the porch as Ilara climbed the steps with Neshoba in her arms. His face had gone tight with the kind of anger that came from fear poorly disguised. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ilara pushed past him through the doorway before he could form the words. The interior of the house was dim and cool, and she moved directly to the table in the center of the main room, laying Neshoba down with more care than she had shown the fence posts. "You cannot keep him here," Vernon said from the doorway. His voice was low and controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "You know what happens when they find Apache on private land. You know what they will assume." Ilara ignored him, already moving to the wash basin to wet a cloth. The blood had soaked through to her dress, dark stains across her chest and arms that would take hours to scrub out. She did not care. When she returned to the table, she began cutting away the damaged shirt with her sewing scissors, revealing the wound beneath. It was a deep gash along his ribs, the kind made by a blade rather than a bullet. The edges were clean, but the bleeding had not stopped. "Are you listening to me?" Vernon took 2 steps into the room. "That warrior has enemies, men who will come looking for him, and when they find him here, they will not care that you were only trying to help. They will burn this house and everything in it. Then leave," Ilara said without looking up. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with the damp cloth. She had tended injured animals before, horses and cattle that had tangled with barbed wire or gotten kicked. The principle was the same. Stop the bleeding, keep it clean, give the body time to heal itself. Vernon made a sound of frustration deep in his throat. "You have been alone too long. It has made you forget how to think properly. That man is dangerous. He is bleeding." Ilara pressed the cloth firmly against the wound. "Everything else can wait." She heard Vernon move behind her, pacing in that agitated way he had when things did not go according to his plans. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Outside, Neshoba's horse whinnied, thirsty and exhausted from whatever journey had brought them both here. "I am going to town," Vernon said finally. "Someone needs to report this. If the territorial marshal hears about it from someone else, it will be worse for all of us." Ilara's hands stilled for just a moment. "He will die if you bring the marshal back here tonight. Better him than us." The door slammed before she could respond, and then she heard Vernon's horse being saddled, heard him ride out at a pace that meant he was serious about his threat. She had perhaps 3 hours before he returned, maybe 4 if the marshal was dealing with other business. Not nearly enough time for Neshoba to heal enough to travel. She looked down at the man on her table. His breathing had steadied slightly, though his face was still pale beneath the brown of his skin. There were scars on his chest and arms, old wounds that had healed badly without proper care. His hands were calloused like hers, the kind that came from years of hard work. One of his fingers had been broken at some point and had set crooked. Ilara returned to cleaning the wound. She worked in silence, her movements gentle despite the size and strength of her hands. When she was satisfied that she had done what she could, she retrieved needle and thread from her sewing basket. The stitching was careful and tight, each pull of the thread deliberate. She had mended enough torn fabric to know how to make something hold. As she tied off the final stitch, Neshoba's eyes opened. They were dark and clear, and they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not flinch or try to sit up. He simply watched her, taking in every detail of her face as if memorizing it. Then his gaze moved to her hands, still holding the needle and thread, to her arms, strong and steady, to her shoulders broad enough to carry weight most women would never attempt, and back to her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough but certain. "You are the one." Ilara set down the needle and thread with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. "Why did you say that? You are the one." Neshoba's eyes did not leave her face. He tried to sit up, winced at the pull of fresh stitches, and settled back against the table with a sharp exhale. When he spoke again, his accent was thick but his meaning clear. I have been looking for someone with real strength, not just muscle but character. Someone who acts without hesitation when others are in need. You do not know me. Alara took a step back, putting distance between them. Her pulse had quickened in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with being seen. Really seen. For the first time in years. I know what I saw. He raised one hand slowly, gesturing toward the door. That man who left. He keeps you here because you work harder than any hired hand he could find, but he hides you away like something shameful. I saw that immediately. The accuracy of it struck her like a physical blow. She turned away, busying herself with cleaning the blood from her hands. The water in the basin turned pink, then red. He gives me work and shelter. That is enough. No. The single word carried absolute certainty. It is not enough. You stay here because you believe you have no other choice. But you are wrong. Alara gripped the edge of the wash basin hard enough that her knuckles went white. You do not know anything about me. You do not know what I have lived through. I know you carried me like I weighed nothing. I know you did not hesitate when you saw I was hurt, even though helping me puts you in danger. I know your hands are steady when they work, and your eyes carry the weight of years spent apologizing for existing. He paused, gathering strength. And I know that among my people, women like you are valued. Women who can work alongside men, who can defend themselves and their families. Women with strength are not hidden away in shame. They are respected members of the community. She turned back to face him, something sharp and painful unfolding in her chest. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand that your world is not the only world, and because I need your help. The honesty of it caught her off guard. She had expected gratitude, perhaps, or empty promises, not this direct request that treated her as an equal capable of making choices. What kind of help? The wound. He touched his side carefully. 3 men attacked our hunting camp 2 days north of here. They killed my brother and took our horses. I tracked them this far before they caught me at the river crossing. I hurt the leader badly before I got away, but they will come looking to finish what they started. Alara felt her stomach drop. How soon? Tomorrow. Maybe tonight if they ride through darkness. His jaw tightened. I need to be gone before they arrive. If they find me here, they will assume you helped me. They will hurt you to get information. I can defend myself, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. 3 armed men against a woman with no weapon and no training, no matter how strong she was. Neshoba studied her for a long moment. Can you ride? Yes. Can you shoot? I have never tried. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his expression. Then I will teach you what I can in the time we have. But first, I need food and water, and you need to decide if you are willing to take a risk. What kind of risk? The kind that changes everything. He pushed himself up on his elbows despite the obvious pain it caused. That man who left will bring back people who want me dead or captured. If you help me escape, you will not be able to stay here anymore. They will know you chose to help an Apache instead of turning him in. Your life here, such as it is, will be over. Alara looked around the small house that had been her prison and her refuge for the past 2 years. At the simple furniture, the sparse belongings, the windows that looked out on endless emptiness. She thought about Vernon returning with the marshal, about explaining why she had defied direct orders, about watching them drag Neshoba away in chains or worse. She thought about the way Neshoba had looked at her, not with pity or disgust or careful politeness, with acknowledgement of what she was capable of doing. Tell me what you need, she said. Alara brought him water first, then bread and dried meat from the small pantry. Neshoba ate slowly, his movements careful around the fresh stitches. While he recovered his strength, she gathered supplies. 2 canteens, a canvas bag with food that would not spoil. The money Vernon kept hidden in a tin beneath the floorboards, enough to get her through a few weeks if she was careful. She took it without guilt. He owed her far more than this for 2 years of labor. You move with purpose, Neshoba observed, watching her work. Like someone who has made difficult decisions before. I have had practice. Alara rolled a blanket tight and secured it with leather straps. My father taught me to always have a bag ready in case we needed to leave quickly. He said people who wait until disaster arrives never survive it. He was a wise man. He was a cautious man. There is a difference. She paused, considering her next words. He also taught me that being different means always being ready to defend yourself, because no one else will do it for you. Neshoba nodded slowly. Among my people, we have a saying. The wolf that hunts alone must be twice as strong and 3 times as smart. You have been that wolf for a long time. Something about the comparison steadied her. She had never thought of her isolation as strength before, only as punishment. But perhaps there was truth in what he said. She had survived. She had learned. She had become capable in ways that softer women never needed to be. Show me how to shoot, she said. He rose from the table with visible effort, one hand pressed against his wounded side. Not yet. First you learn to move. A weapon is useless if you cannot position yourself correctly. He gestured toward the open space in the center of the room. Come here. Ilara approached slowly, uncertain what he intended. Neshoba circled her once, studying her frame with the same attention she had seen horses evaluated before purchase. But there was no judgment in his eyes, only assessment. You are strong, he said. Stronger than most men I have known. But you carry yourself like someone ashamed of that strength. Your shoulders curve inward. Your head bows. You try to make yourself smaller. He reached out and touched her shoulder blade gently. Stand straight. Let your spine remember what it was built to do. She straightened slowly, feeling muscles protest against years of habitual slouching. The change in perspective was immediate and startling. From this height she could see the top of Neshoba's head, could look down at him the way men had always looked down at her. There. His voice held satisfaction. Now you see the world as you were meant to see it. Not from below, but from your true place. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. No one had ever told her to stand taller before. Every interaction of her life had involved the opposite instruction. Make yourself smaller. Take up less space. Do not draw attention. When those men come, Neshoba continued, they will expect you to cower, to beg, to be weak because you are a woman alone. That expectation is your greatest weapon. They will not see the danger until it is too late. What danger? Her voice came out rougher than intended. I have no training for fighting. I would not know where to start. You have been training your whole life. You just did not know it. He moved to stand directly in front of her. Pick me up. She blinked. You are injured. Pick me up anyway. Ilara hesitated only a moment before stepping forward and scooping him up with the same ease she had shown earlier. He was solid weight in her arms, but she held him steady without straining. Most women could not do this, he said calmly. Most men would struggle, but you barely notice the effort. Now imagine using that strength when someone attacks you. Imagine grabbing them and throwing them aside like they weigh nothing. Imagine their surprise, their fear. She set him down carefully, her mind racing with the implications. She had spent so long thinking of her strength as something shameful that she had never considered it as something useful, something powerful. The first rule of surviving a fight, Neshoba said, is understanding what advantages you have that your enemy does not expect. You have many advantages, Ilara. You simply need to stop apologizing for them. Outside, the sun was dropping toward the horizon. Vernon would be returning soon, and with him would come decisions that could not be unmade. But for the first time in her life, Ilara felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder and more dangerous than hope. Recognition of her own capability. The sound of approaching horses reached them before sunset. Multiple riders, moving fast. Ilara moved to the window and counted 3 silhouettes against the darkening sky. Not Vernon's careful pace, not the marshal's organized approach. These men rode with the urgency of hunters closing in on prey. They are here, she said quietly. Neshoba was already moving despite his injury, gathering the supplies she had prepared. The back door. We go now. But even as he spoke, 2 more riders appeared from the opposite direction, cutting off that route. 5 men total, spreading out to surround the house. They had planned this carefully, waited until the light was failing to make their move. Ilara felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. We are trapped, not trapped. Cornered. There is a difference. Neshoba moved to stand beside her at the window. Trapped means no options. Cornered means they think we have no options. They are wrong. The lead rider dismounted 20 feet from the front porch. He was tall and lean, with a face weathered by sun and violence. A knife hung from his belt, the blade long enough to have made the wound in Neshoba's side. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the open window. We know you are in there, Apache. And we know someone helped you. Send out the woman and maybe we will let her live. Ilara felt Neshoba tense beside her. She touched his arm, stopping him before he could respond. Then she did something that surprised them both. She opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The reaction was immediate. All 5 men stopped moving, staring up at her with expressions that shifted rapidly from expectation to confusion to something that might have been concern. She stood at her full height, shoulders back the way Neshoba had taught her, and let them see exactly what they were dealing with. The tall man recovered first. Where is the Apache? Inside. Ilara's voice was calm, wounded and weak. He will not give you any trouble. Then why are you standing in our way? Because I stitched that wound, and I do not like seeing my work undone. One of the other men laughed, a harsh sound. Your work? Lady, we did not ride all this way to argue with the help. Step aside, or we will move you aside. Ilara descended the porch steps slowly, each footfall deliberate. As she reached ground level, the full difference in their heights became obvious. She was taller than the leader by several inches, taller than all of them. The laughter died away. You can try, she said quietly. The leader's hand moved toward his knife. Ilara moved faster than he expected, her long reach and natural strength giving her an advantage he had not calculated. She caught his wrist mid-draw and twisted, applying the same force she used to wrestle fence posts into position. The knife fell from his grip with a metallic clatter. The other men rushed forward. Ilara pivoted, using the leader's body as a shield, and shoved him backward into the closest attacker. They went down in a tangle of limbs. A third man grabbed her arm. She turned into the grip instead of away from it, surprising him, and drove her shoulder into his chest hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. What advantages you have that your enemy does not expect. The remaining 2 men hesitated, suddenly unsure. They had expected an easy target, a frightened woman who would collapse under pressure. Instead, they faced someone who moved with confidence and strength they had not prepared to counter. Behind her, the door opened again. Neshoba stood in the doorway, one of Vernon's hunting rifles in his hands. His face was pale with pain, but his aim was steady. Leave now, he said, while you still can. The 5 men exchanged glances, calculating odds that no longer favored them. But the leader pushed himself to his feet, cradling his twisted wrist, his expression dark with humiliation and rage. We will be back, with more men, and when we return, you will both pay for this. Before Ilara could respond, new hoofbeats thundered from the southern road. Vernon, returning with Marshal Hendricks earlier than expected. The 5 men heard it too, their faces shifting from rage to calculation. Being caught attacking a woman's property by the law would end very differently than a quiet revenge in the dark. They mounted quickly and rode north, but this time their departure felt different. Not a retreat, a postponement. Vernon dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face flushed with anger and something that looked dangerously close to fear. Behind him, Marshal Hendricks took his time, studying the scene with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading situations before acting. His gaze moved from Ilara to Neshoba in the doorway, to the dust still hanging in the air from the departed riders. What happened here? The marshal's voice was neutral, professional. I helped someone who was hurt, Ilara said before Vernon could speak. 5 men came looking for him. They threatened violence. I convinced them to leave. Vernon made a sound of disbelief. Convinced them? Marshal, she attacked them. I saw the tracks. Multiple horses, signs of a struggle. She harbored a fugitive and then assaulted citizens trying to enforce justice. Justice? Ilara turned the full weight of her attention on Vernon. Those men murdered his brother and stole from their hunting camp. They came here to finish killing him. That is not justice. That is revenge. Marshal Hendricks dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually near his pistol. Not threatening, but present. The Apache. He has a name? Neshoba, Ilara said. Neshoba himself remained silent, watching the exchange with dark eyes that missed nothing. And those men who were here. You know their names? Vernon shifted uncomfortably. They were not from town. Probably drifters passing through. So we have 5 unnamed men with no proof of their accusations, against 1 injured man and a woman defending her property. The marshal's tone remained even. Seems to me the situation is not as clear as you made it sound, Vernon. She should have turned him in, Vernon insisted. The moment she found him, she should have sent for you. Instead, she treated him like a guest. Fed him. Protected him. Made herself complicit in whatever crimes he may have committed. What crimes? Alara's voice rose for the first time. Being Apache? Being injured? Having the misfortune to survive when men tried to murder him? You do not understand how things work out here. Vernon's face had gone red. There are rules, boundaries, lines you do not cross if you want to survive. Helping one of them means choosing sides, and that is a choice with consequences. Then I choose consequences. The words came out clear and final. Because the alternative is becoming someone I cannot live with. Silence settled over the scene. Marshal Hendricks studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Neshoba. Can you ride? Neshoba nodded once, his hand still pressed against his wounded side. Then I suggest you do that. Soon. Before those drifters decide to come back with friends. The marshal turned to Vernon. And you brought me out here on a false report. Made it sound like an emergency when what you really wanted was someone to handle a problem you were too afraid to handle yourself. Vernon's mouth opened and closed without sound. This is still my property, he managed finally. I want both of them gone by morning. That will not be a problem, Alara said. I was already planning to leave. The marshal nodded, satisfied. Then we have no issue here. Vernon, you ride back with me. Let them gather their things in peace. He mounted his horse with the ease of long practice, then paused to look down at Alara. You defended yourself and someone under your protection. That is not a crime in my jurisdiction. But those men will talk. Word will spread. You should head somewhere that word travels slower. I understand. After they left, Alara stood motionless in the yard, processing what had just happened. She had defied Vernon, challenged the established order, chosen to help someone society said she should have turned away. And in doing so, she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Behind her, Neshoba spoke quietly. You gave up everything to help me. Your home, your safety, your place in this world. She turned to face him, and something fierce burned in her chest. I gave up nothing that mattered. This was never my home. Safety is an illusion when you are too afraid to stand straight, and my place in this world was never here to begin with. Then where? I do not know yet. She met his eyes without flinching. But I think that is the point. For the first time in my life, I get to find out. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow they would leave. Tonight, they would prepare. And somewhere in the distance, a new life waited to be claimed by someone finally ready to reach for it. Morning came cold and clear. Alara had spent most of the night preparing supplies, checking saddles, and avoiding the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her when she allowed them space. Now she stood in the yard, 2 horses ready, bags packed with everything she owned that mattered, which turned out to be remarkably little. Neshoba emerged from the house moving more easily than he had the day before. The stitches were holding, and his color had improved. He would be able to travel, though not comfortably. He crossed to where she stood and stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the morning chill. You are afraid, he said. It was not a question. Yes, there was no point in lying. I have never been anywhere but here. I do not know how to be someone other than who I have been. You have already become someone different. You simply have not noticed yet. He reached up slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted. When she did not move, he touched her face with surprising gentleness. His hand was rough with calluses, but his touch was careful. Yesterday you stood against 5 men. You chose freedom over safety. You stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. That is not the same person who hid here for 2 years. Alara felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been locked away so long she had forgotten it existed. She leaned into his touch without thinking, starving for kindness that did not come with conditions or shame. Among my people, Neshoba continued quietly, strength is not something to hide. It is honored, celebrated. A woman who can hunt and fight and survive alone is valued above gold. You would not be unwanted there. You would be remarkable. I do not need to be remarkable, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just need to stop feeling like an apology. Then stop. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to look down to meet his eyes, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the slight crookedness of his nose from an old break, close enough to feel his breath against her collarbone. You are not too tall. You are not too strong. You are not too much of anything. You are exactly enough. And anyone who made you believe otherwise was afraid of what you represent. What do I represent? Proof that their rules are meaningless, that strength comes in forms they did not anticipate, that women do not need to be small and quiet and grateful to have value. His hand moved from her face to her shoulder, solid and steady. You terrify them because you exist outside their understanding of how the world should work, and that is their failure, not yours. Alara could not speak past the tightness in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with certainty instead of pity, with admiration instead of tolerance. She reached up and covered his hand with her own, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady rhythm of his pulse where her fingers rested against his wrist. Behind them she heard the sound of a door opening. Vernon stood on the porch, watching them with an expression she could not quite read. Not anger anymore. Something sadder. Something like regret for an opportunity lost, or a truth recognized too late. He stayed there for a moment, witness to the connection forming between two people his world had deemed incompatible, then turned and went back inside without speaking. Neshoba's gaze had not left her face. The choice is still yours. You can stay. Make peace with Vernon. Return to the life you knew. No one would fault you for choosing safety. I would fault myself. She said it with absolute conviction. I spent 26 years learning to make myself smaller. I will not spend the rest of my life doing the same. Something shifted in his expression. Pride, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He stepped back slowly, releasing her but holding her gaze. Then we ride together, as equals, not as the unwanted woman and the Apache warrior, but as two people who refuse to accept the limits others tried to place on them. Where will we go? North, to the high country where my people make winter camp. The journey will take several days. It will not be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Alara mounted her horse with practiced ease, settling into the saddle as if she had been born to it. From this height, the world looked different, larger, full of possibility instead of limitation. Neshoba mounted more carefully, favoring his injured side, but once in the saddle his posture straightened with the confidence of a man on familiar ground. He looked at her across the space between their horses, and for just a moment the rest of the world fell away. Ready? He asked. Alara looked back at the house one final time, at the place that had sheltered her and imprisoned her in equal measure, at Vernon's silhouette visible through the window, already turning away, at the fence post she had set, the work she had done, the years she had spent trying to earn acceptance from people who would never give it. Then she turned her horse north and did not look back again. They reached the Apache winter camp on the 4th day of travel. The journey had been hard, pushing through rough terrain with Neshoba still recovering from his wound. They had traveled cautiously, watching for signs of pursuit, but the 5 men had not followed. Either they were gathering reinforcements as promised, or they had decided the effort was not worth the risk. Alara hoped for the latter, but prepared for the former. She saw the smoke from cooking fires first, then the shelters arranged in a wide circle near a stream that cut through the valley. As they descended the rocky trail, figures emerged from between the structures, alerted by the sound of approaching horses. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered, watching with open curiosity as Neshoba and his unusual companion rode into camp. An older woman stepped forward first. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her face carried the lines of someone who had lived through hardship and survived it. She looked at Neshoba with obvious relief, then turned her attention to Alara. Her gaze traveled upward, taking in the full height of the woman who sat straight and tall in her saddle, no longer trying to make herself smaller. The woman spoke in her own language, rapid and questioning. Neshoba responded, gesturing toward Alara as he explained. The conversation continued for several minutes while Alara sat motionless, aware of the eyes studying her from every direction. Children had crept closer, staring with unguarded fascination. Men stood with arms crossed, expressions neutral but watchful. Women whispered to each other behind raised hands. Then the older woman approached Alara's horse and reached up. Alara took her offered hand and dismounted, suddenly face to face with someone who barely reached her shoulder. The woman circled her once, just as Neshoba had done days earlier, but where his assessment had been tactical, hers was measuring something different. She spoke again, and this time Neshoba translated. She is my mother. She asks if you are the one who saved my life. Alara nodded. I did what anyone should have done. He was hurt, Neshoba translated, and his mother responded with a longer statement. His expression softened as he relayed her words. She says you are clearly strong enough to have carried me, and brave enough to have defended me against those who meant harm. She sees these things with her own eyes. She says such qualities are valuable in any community, and you are welcome here if you choose to stay. Something broke loose inside Alara's chest. She had prepared herself for rejection, for more stares and whispers and careful distance. She had not prepared for acceptance based solely on what she had done and what she was capable of doing. Neshoba's mother gestured toward the camp, issuing instructions that sent people scattering to prepare. Then she turned back to Alara and smiled, a warm expression that transformed her weathered face. She took Alara's hand and led her toward the center of camp, speaking continuously in a language Alara did not yet understand, but somehow felt she could learn. Over the following hours, Alara was introduced to the rhythm of life in the winter camp, women who worked alongside men without shame, children who ran and played and shouted without being told to quiet down, elders who offered wisdom instead of judgment, and everywhere, people who looked at her height and strength with practical appreciation rather than discomfort. They saw what she could do, not what she failed to be. When the evening meal was prepared, Neshoba's mother placed Alara beside her son at the fire. The message was clear to everyone watching. This woman was under their protection. She belonged here because she had earned it through her actions. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Neshoba leaned close enough that his shoulder touched hers. Still afraid? Alara watched the faces around the fire, illuminated by dancing flames, faces that looked at her without expecting her to apologize for existing. "No," she said quietly. "Not anymore." "Good." His hand found hers in the darkness between them, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Because tomorrow, my mother wants you to help move the winter supplies. She says it usually takes 4 men. She thinks you can do it faster." Alara laughed, a sound she had not made in so long it felt foreign in her throat. She might be right. She usually is. Neshoba squeezed her hand gently. "Welcome home, Alara." She looked down at their joined hands, at the community that had accepted her based on merit rather than appearance, at the man who had recognized her capability when everyone else saw only difference. And for the first time in her 26 years, Alara Volkmann understood what it meant to be valued for exactly who she was. The unwanted woman had finally found her place, not by making herself smaller, but by standing tall. If you want to see another powerful story from the Wild West, click on the video on your screen right now. These tales of courage and transformation will keep you coming back for more. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that might change how you see the world. Click that video now.